Today we're going to look at the juxtaposition of the ghastly and the everyday in three texts: The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, the interesting thing about everyday and Gothic is that so many Gothic stories contain normal situations with something supernatural, something unknown, something very interesting. The settings can be perfectly normal. Take, for example, the Yorkshire Moors in Wuthering Heights, a perfectly normal, very British setting. Or we could look at Dr. Faustus, who was simply a university lecturer, another simple profession. The Bloody Chamber is slightly more complicated, but of course, a lot of the characters in there are maybe simple peasants, for example, in a lot of the werewolf stories. So what's really interesting is how all of these authors entwine these two things together to make the Gothic texts what they are and structure these truly fantastic stories. Now, one of the most important things to remember about writing an essay in the A-level exam is the objectives. You could write a perfectly good essay, but not if you don't follow the objectives and stick to the guidelines which the A2 Examination Board have laid out for you, you will not get the marks that you need. AO1, remember to write a good structured argument. Focus on the question. We're talking about the ghastly and we're talking about the normal. Remember to entwine them and keep them going throughout your essay. AO2, structure, form and language. Exactly how do the writers portray their meanings across through the words, the structure, the form that they use in their texts. AO3, interpretation. Remember, as well as using different perspectives, evaluate the perspectives. Talk about the strengths and weaknesses of thinking about this in different ways. Think about feminist interpretations, Freudian analysis. There are all sorts of different things that you can think about. AO4, think about the context the texts were written in. When were they written? When were they received? How would modern audiences interpret it today? Were there sort of rules or religious beliefs or all sorts of beliefs and times which people used to think about at the time that they were written? Remember to include all of these within your argument and you will do the best you can. Now we're going to go to our Wuthering Heights correspondent, Helen Holmes. So Helen, tell us about the ghastly and the normal interwoven in Wuthering Heights.
Hello. Well, we're going to be thinking about the features that are important in the Gothic genre, which one of them are relevant to the text of Wuthering Heights, and how they can be interpreted in the context of the ghastly and the everyday. For instance, the context of Wuthering Heights can also be the genre. For example, the genre is clearly the Gothic to some extent, but there is also an aspect of the Victorian domestic novel. For example, the violence, which is so important in the Gothic conventions, is also reinterpreted in Wuthering Heights as a form of the domestic. For instance, several quotes can be used for the example of AO2, such as painting the house front in Hindley's blood. The violent Gothic imagery of this clearly shows Heathcliff's character, and yet also there is an aspect of the domestic interwoven in this. The same is true of quotes such as, "I will make you swallow the carving knife," and the part where Hindley drops Hareton down the stairs. This is also a context point, as this shows a clearly domestic aspect, as well as showing the violence of the Gothic. However, this could be seen to undermine the Gothic conventions, as to some extent, this violence draws the text away from the Gothic and draws it towards the Victorian domestic novel, showing that Wuthering Heights, the genre of Wuthering Heights, is certainly under some, what is the word I'm looking for?
Scrutiny.
Scrutiny, thank you. There we go.
Next we're going to talk about Dr. Faustus. Marlowe uses some comedy scenes involving the characters of lower social status, and when juxtaposed with the scenes of terror, such as Faustus's fall to hell, these exacerbate the effects of both of these scenes and make the Gothic more poignant. He also uses everyday religious beliefs and takes the Gothic elements from them, such as the ideas of hell, and by using elements of everyday life, he makes it more effective, as it could feasibly happen to these people in terms of their religious beliefs. It could be suggested, as in Wuthering Heights, as our correspondent Helen pointed out, that these everyday aspects undermine the Gothic. However, we feel that in Dr. Faustus that they're very effective in making Gothic sentences such as "My soul to the devil for a shoulder of mutton," which uses hyperbole. He uses the Gothic effects of exaggeration and supernatural references to terrify the audience. And next we're going to talk about the Bloody Chamber.
One of the first instances where Angela Carter combines the ghastly and the everyday is in The Snow Child, where she takes a traditional family relationship and turns it completely on its head, using lots of sexual symbolism, incest, and the typical elements of the Gothic, such as horror and terror, what with the gore when the girl dies, and at the end when the Countess gets bitten by the rose. It bites. The Bloody Chamber itself, the actual story at the start, is similar in this, that it looks at the roles of women in relationships and marriage. And this combination of Gothic elements, such as the horror when she has her virginity taken by the Marquise, a dozen husbands impales a dozen brides, combining the violent imagery with the sex, is combining the Gothic and the everyday. And actually, Angela Carter makes the Gothic extra good by sort of juxtaposing it with the everyday things, and emphasises the fact that it is so horrific and terrible, and uses it to her own ends to put across her own feminist ideals. Another instance where Carter combines the Gothic and the everyday is in the domesticity of the Earl King. He is an excellent housewife. It's one of the first instances we get the idea that something isn't quite right with the Earl King and his beautifully described, beautiful domestic setting in the forest. Carter's uses of ominous, foreboding sentences such as "the Earl King will do you grievous harm" adds to the idea that there isn't something quite right about this, and although it may appear every day and that he cooks and he cleans and he goes to the forest, actually there is something very sinister about the Earl King and his domestic setting.
In conclusion, the Bloody Chamber and Wuthering Heights combine the ghastly and the normal to create the Gothic and make it much more sinister than would normally be. The fact that we've got this contrast makes the Gothic even more ghastly than it would if it was just by itself. However, we feel that personally Wuthering Heights uses the normal to slightly undermine the everyday and slightly undermine the Gothic to make it less realistic and possibly more ridiculous and more convoluted.
Bad dreams in the night. It's all